As I made my way back to my cabin, the air felt thick with the chill of night creeping in. The sharp scent of damp earth lingered, mixing with the distant wood smoke from a village far enough away that it offered no comfort. The ground beneath my feet was uneven and cracked from harsh winters, while patches of frost glimmered in the fading light, reflecting the last golden rays from a sun that was slipping below the horizon. The sky displayed shades of burnt orange and deep violet, casting long shadows over the barren fields around me. Suddenly, a soft whimper reached my ears, barely audible over the sound of the wind. It wasn't a simple call, it was a cry filled with deep exhaustion, a plea that demanded my attention. I paused, straining to make sense of the sound. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted her. A dog crouched just beside the road, somewhat concealed in the brittle grass. Her body was tense yet fragile, each breath visible against the sharp outlines of her ribs. Her once white coat was now coated in dust and dirt, hanging from her thin frame in matted patches. But what held my gaze were her eyes, wide and unblinking, filled with a mix of hunger and something else, a desperate hope. At her feet, 3 tiny puppies huddled, their bodies shaking from both the cold and their apparent hunger. They were little more than bundles of dirt-specked fur, struggling to find the strength to lift their heads. The mother nudged them gently with her snout, a low whine escaping her as she tried to reassure them. Her protective instinct was evident despite her frail state. She positioned herself between them and me, her front legs trembling as she fought to remain standing. In that moment, I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. I was not an animal rescuer or someone accustomed to facing such distress. Here I stood, confronted with a scene that stirred something deep within me, caught between wanting to help and feeling woefully unprepared. The chilling air wrapped around me as I stood before the trembling figures, a mother dog and her 3 tiny puppies. They seemed to embody desperation, caught in a moment where instinct and trust collided. It was clear she had chosen to approach me, risking everything just for a chance at help. This wasn't simply about hunger. She had exhausted her options and was out of time. I took a measured step closer, my breath creating a fog in the cold as I crouched down to appear less intimidating. "Hey there, girl," I whispered softly, letting my voice be carried by the wind. "You're safe with me." Though her body stiffened and her ears flattened, she remained close, torn between the instinct to protect her puppies and the hope that I was there to assist. The little ones stirred slightly, their tiny paws barely moving, their empty bellies too weak to make a sound. As I looked around the vast open land, it became apparent there was no shelter in sight, just an endless stretch of desolate earth and the encroaching night. The mother's strength had waned, but her love for her puppies shone through her weary frame. The thought tightened in my chest. I felt a mix of concern and determination. I knew I couldn't just turn my back on them. The moment felt suspended in time, every breath I took deliberate as I continued to approach. I later named the mother dog Mara. She stood rigid, her golden brown eyes darting between her puppies and me, gauging whether I was a friend or foe. The breeze carried the scents of damp soil and faint remnants of food she must have scavenged. Lowering myself further, I held my hands open in front of me, working to bridge the gap without triggering her instincts. Her frame told a story of hardship, ribs exposed beneath her tattered coat, and raw patches of skin revealing the toll that hunger and exposure had taken. Her legs trembled, frail yet resilient, as she held her ground. The puppies nestled against her, small and motionless like living, warm stones, fully reliant on their mother's strength. In a quiet moment, I noticed the smallest puppy, marked by a patch of black over its eye, shift weakly. The whimper it let out was so faint that it barely broke the silence, but my heart tightened at the sound. These tiny creatures were running on sheer will, their fragile bodies struggling to express their need. Earlier, I had shoved a small piece of bread into my pocket almost absent-mindedly, but now it felt like a lifeline. Carefully, I took it out, tore off a portion, and held it out, waiting to see if this little offering might coax Mara, the mother dog, to let her guard down. Her nose twitched, and she leaned forward slightly before pausing to size me up as if I were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. To give her some space, I set the bread down and backed away a little. The seconds dragged on, stretching the quiet between us. Then, finally, she took a tentative step forward. Each movement was slow and cautious, her eyes fixed on mine. She sniffed at the bread, and after what felt like an eternity, she snatched it up and swallowed it whole, not even pausing to chew. I observed her body tense, watching for any sign of a threat from me. When nothing happened, she licked her lips and glanced back at me. "Good girl," I said softly, my voice blending with the whisper of the wind. "It's okay." At the sound of my words, her ears perked up slightly, and for a fleeting moment, the sharpness of her gaze softened. It wasn't trust just yet, but it felt like a small crack in the barrier she had built around her and her pups. However, just as I moved to inch closer, a sudden, sharp cry erupted from the smallest puppy, shattering the stillness. Immediately, Mara turned, her body tensing as a growl rumbled in her throat. She lowered herself, teeth bared just enough to remind me that even in her weakened state, she was ready to protect her young. I froze, raising my hands slowly. "Hey, it's all right. I understand," I reassured her softly, feeling my pulse pick up but remaining still. I realized that my attempt to help wouldn't be as simple as offering food. The bond of trust would need to be earned. Mara was still a mother first, and if I truly wanted to assist her, I had to prove that I could be trusted in the fragile space she had created for her puppies. As night began to settle in, the air turned sharply cold, sending a chill through my jacket. The fading sunlight painted the sky a smoky blue, and I knew the temperature would drop further. I had ventured out seeking firewood, caught off guard by the unexpected sight of a mother dog standing protectively between me and her 3 puppies. Given the circumstances, I realized I couldn't walk away. I needed to help them. Mara's frail body was a clear signal that time was running out. The wind howled through the fields, creating an eerie silence that only amplified the sense of urgency. I noticed her eyes darting nervously between her pups and me, torn between instinct and the desperate need for safety. A soft whimper from one of the puppies had shattered the fragile trust I was building just moments earlier. I couldn't simply leave them to face the freezing night. The thought of returning in the morning to find them lifeless, huddled together in a helpless embrace, weighed heavily on my heart. It was imperative that I formulated a plan quickly. So, I crouched low, moving slowly to avoid startling Mara further. I knew patience would be key. I reached into my bag for the remnants of a dried sausage I had packed for myself, tearing it into small pieces and placing it carefully on the ground in front of me. The moment the smell reached Mara, I could see her internal struggle. Her protective stance remained, but her stomach let out a low growl, a confession of hunger that overshadowed her fear. She paused, then took a cautious step forward. I held my breath as she approached, every movement filled with tension, yet fueled by the instinct to nourish herself and her pups. This was a moment that could change everything. As the cold began to set in, I could see the bleakness of the situation. Time was not on our side, and the puppies nestled against each other were starting to tremble. Their uneven breathing made it clear that they were struggling. I didn't need special training to recognize the signs. They were fighting against hunger and the biting chill. If I didn't act quickly, it wouldn't matter how much food I had brought. Mara, the mother, seemed to sense their distress as well. She gently nudged each puppy with her nose, checking on them, making sure they were still with her. The smallest pup, marked by a dark patch over one eye, stirred but didn't respond much to her touch. It was clear that she felt their weakness, her low, mixed growl and whimper betraying her worry. In that moment, I understood that she was uncertain about me, but recognized that they needed help. Taking a deep breath, I decided I couldn't leave them like this. "I can't leave you out here," I said softly, making sure my tone was calm. "I don't know your story, but you'll need warmth to survive the night." I gradually removed my jacket and sweater, leaving me with just my shirt, and laid the sweater on the ground nearby. Small comfort, but it was something warmer than the cold earth they were resting on. "Come on, girl," I encouraged her. "It's for them." At first, Mara remained still, and I feared she might choose pride or instinct over the survival of her pups. But then, to my relief, she shifted her focus back to her little ones. With a gentle nudge, she started to guide them toward the warmth of the fabric, despite their initial resistance. They were weak and unsure, and it took a moment for them to respond to her persistent nudging. I held my breath, watching as she stepped back, her eyes still fixed on me, showing a mixture of tension and trust. In that quiet space, she had made a choice. She had entrusted me with her puppies. I took a moment to steady my breath, feeling the chill of the night air around me. Scooping the 3 puppies into my sweater, I made sure to move slowly and gently, careful not to alarm their mother, whose anxious gaze was fixed on me. The smallest puppy barely stirred. He felt dangerously fragile, his little head resting against my arm. I met the mother dog's eyes, a silent question passing between us. Would she trust me enough to follow? Her body tensed, ribs rising and falling with every deep breath. It was as though she was weighing her choices, caught between fear and a growing understanding. Finally, she took a cautious step forward, trembling slightly, until she was close enough for me to feel her warm breath against my skin. While she didn't fully trust me, she seemed to understand that I was her best shot at safety. That flicker of trust was all I needed. I gathered the puppies closer and stood up. "Let's go home," I said softly. The journey back felt fragile, each step a careful balance. The bundled puppies barely moved, tucked securely in my sweater. Mara, the mother dog, followed closely behind, her pace slow and tentative. She remained a shadow in the dim surroundings, hesitant but resolute, embodying the struggle between fear and the obligation to protect her young. As the cold seeped through my clothing, the darkness enveloped the landscape, the only light coming from my cabin's porch, a small, inviting glow amidst the endless void. The cabin stood at the edge of the village, embraced by swaying trees that rustled like whispering souls. Inside, I wasn't sure what awaited us, whether Mara would feel secure enough to enter, or if the puppies would manage to endure the night. But one thought was clear: they couldn't stay out in this cold. When I reached the front steps, I adjusted my grip on the fragile bundle. Their little bodies felt both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. I turned to look back at Mara, who had halted a few feet away, her paws firmly planted on the ground, caught between trust and hesitation. "Come on, girl," I urged, gently pushing the door open with my foot. Warm air rushed out, carrying the comforting scent of the smoldering fire inside. As the door cracked open, one of the puppies let out a weak whimper, stirring slightly in my arms. The stillness inside the cabin was suddenly disrupted by a sound, a sharp knock on the door that echoed through the quiet space. I felt the vibrations travel through the wooden walls, heightening my senses. Before that moment, I had been kneeling by the hearth, trying to provide warmth to the 3 tiny puppies nestled together. Their bellies gently rose and fell in rhythm, a comforting sight amidst the uncertainty. The smallest, whom I had taken to calling Nico, hardly moved at all. Nearby, Mara, who had cautiously entered the cabin, continued her exploration. She circled the room with caution, her body tense and ribs showing through her thin frame. I understood her unease. She needed reassurance that she and her puppies were safe from any hidden threats. Just as I started to relax, her demeanor shifted. The quiet hum of the cabin transformed into tension as Mara's ears perked up, her body tightening like a coiled spring. A low growl emerged from her throat, instinctual and deep, echoing my own rising anxiety. I followed her gaze toward the door, my heart quickening. There was no mistaking it. Outside, footsteps were crunching against the frozen dirt, heavy and ominous. Slowly, I rose to my feet, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. This was late, far too late for anyone to be wandering out here. The village was miles away, and the nearest farm required a good 10-minute walk down the road. The presence of another, whether friend or foe, felt unsettling. Mara's growl grew louder, her instincts taking over. In that moment, I reached for the fire poker resting against the stone hearth, gripping its cold metal handle firmly. Then came another knock, more forceful this time. Whoever was out there had purpose. My pulse raced as a realization settled in. Something told me that their reason for coming was tied to Mara and her puppies. The atmosphere grew tense as the knock echoed through the small cabin. It wasn't the typical sound of a friendly traveler seeking shelter. This knock was heavier, more probing. A hand pressed against the door, testing its strength. I could feel Mara at my side, her growl rising sharply, a low rumble reflecting her protective instincts. Taking a deep breath, I positioned myself between her and the entrance, gripping the cold fire poker in my hand. The metal felt solid, a reassuring weight as I focused on maintaining my composure. The quiet of the night was unusual. In these parts, people tended to respect each other's space, especially after dark. But something about this moment felt different. "Who's there?" My voice was steady, despite the uneasiness creeping along my spine that urged me to retreat into silence. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wall, filling the silence where a response should have been. After what felt like an eternity, a voice finally emerged, a low, rough tone that suggested a hard life. "I'm looking for a dog." Those words sent a chill coursing through me. "What dog?" I asked, my grip tightening instinctively. "A stray," the man explained. "White, thin, had some pups. She came through here earlier." There was a beat, and I could hear the crunch of his boots shifting on the ground outside. "You seen her?" I glanced back at Mara, who stood rigid, every muscle tense. Her eyes were fixed on the door, revealing a recognition that was more than fear. She understood who was on the other side, and wanted no part of it. "I haven't seen anything," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. The silence stretched on, only broken by the rattling of the doorknob. My heartbeat quickened. This wasn't just anyone. It was someone determined to penetrate my safe space. Mara's snarl was sharp and fierce, clearly stating that any intruder would face her wrath if they dared to come through. A moment passed, then the man chuckled, a deep, humorless sound. "You might want to be careful," he warned, deliberately paced. "A dog like that's bad luck, brings problems, sometimes worse than that." His words lingered in the cool air, thick with hidden implications. Then, without another sound, I heard him step back, retreating into the darkness, the crunch of his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared from sight. As I crouched near Mara, our gazes met briefly. My voice softened as I asked, "Who was that?" It was an unanswered question, and yet I could see something in her eyes that suggested this moment was about more than just fear. There was a depth there, something ancient that hinted at escape rather than survival. Before this moment, I had been wholly absorbed in the urgency of rescuing Mara and her 3 puppies, who nestled snugly in my sweater, blissfully unaware of how close they had come to danger. But now, the reality began to settle in. The knock at the door, the stranger's voice, and the way he had tested the latch, all replayed in my mind, like a persistent riddle. I realized I hadn't stopped to consider where Mara had come from, or why she had approached me instead of blending into the crowd. Now, the matter was urgent. Who or what was she fleeing from? Since that unsettling encounter, Mara had remained by the door, her body tense and poised, her ears alert, as if she were still tuned into something lurking beyond. It was clear she was waiting for him to return, and I sensed that the connection between them was not entirely severed. Taking a cautious step closer, I knelt down to meet her gaze, careful not to disrupt the fragile bond of trust we were building. "He wasn't just looking for any stray, was he?" I murmured, hoping for reassurance. For a brief moment, Mara's golden eyes met mine before flicking back to the door, anticipating his return. The puppies stirred beneath my sweater, their weak squeaks breaking through the tension. A wave of protectiveness washed over me as I felt their tiny bodies move. They were still too weak to stand, a testament to whatever hardships they had faced prior to our meeting. I needed to understand this situation better. With resolve, I grabbed my coat and approached the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence enveloped me, but the weight of unanswered questions lingered in the air. The night enveloped the house, silence blanketing everything outside. I sat by the fire, which had now dwindled to glowing embers, casting wavering shadows along the walls. Sleep eluded me, my thoughts circling like the smoke. The encounter with the stranger lingered in my mind, particularly how Mara had reacted to him. There was a connection there, a history I couldn't yet grasp. Mara lay protectively curled around her 3 puppies, finally allowing herself a moment of rest after showing signs of distress. Even in slumber, her body was wired, tense and alert, her ears flicked at the slightest noise. The exhaustion was evident in her shallow breaths, yet I knew that if danger approached, she would leap to her feet without hesitation, ready to defend her little ones. Earlier I had peered out into the night, the cold air rushing in as I opened the door just wide enough to inspect the darkness. The porch was empty. with a dirt road stretching infinitely in either direction, devoid of footprints that could give me clues. But that felt misleading. I couldn't shake the notion that someone was out there, perhaps watching and waiting in the shadows. As I closed the door and bolted it, Mara seemed to relax slightly at the sound, her tail flicking nervously. She was aware of the tension, and I could sense the bond between us growing. Moving back to the warmth of the fire, I tossed another log onto the embers, mesmerized by the vibrant hues that danced around the room. While I stared into the flames, questions flooded my mind. If Mara and her pups had been searched for, it implied she once had a home. Yet here she was, starving and frightened, barely able to stand. Who had left her in such a dire state? The fire crackled and popped, breaking my reverie. Mara stirred, but she didn't approach me. Instead, she gently nudged each of her puppies, ensuring they were safe and real. Then she settled beside them, curling her body protectively around their fragile forms. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I wish I knew the kind of trouble you've been in, girl," I murmured. "But you're safe here, I promise." She didn't respond or meet my gaze, but her lack of aggression was reassuring enough for me at that moment. However, as the shadows deepened and the weight of the night settled around us, an unsettling feeling took hold. The man I had seen hadn't come looking for her. He had been hunting her. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this was merely the beginning, and something inside told me he wouldn't stop. As I glanced at the door, my thoughts were heavy. I knew keeping the stray dog and her 3 puppies came with risks, yet turning them away felt unthinkable. The moment Mara had wandered into my life, trusting me with her little ones, I found myself faced with something far beyond a simple act of kindness. I could already picture it, a shelter in the next town, a place where they could receive care better suited to their needs. But the idea of separating them, of handing them over to strangers, left me uneasy. What if they didn't stay together? Would Mara and her pups end up alone, waiting in a cold cage, hoping for someone to choose them? The man who had knocked on my door earlier was a lingering shadow in my mind, his presence a reminder that danger lurked just outside. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Keeping them meant risking future encounters, questions that felt charged with threats. But the alternative, abandoning them to an uncertain fate, was equally daunting. Could I really just walk away from the life they had already endured? As I considered my options, the smallest puppy nestled in my sweater stirred, a faint reminder of their resilience. It was still weak, but it was alive. They all were. In that moment, I recognized that fear couldn't dictate my choices. I couldn't allow it to be the reason I turned my back on this fragile family that had come to me in their time of need. I leaned back against the wall, taking a deep breath as I stared at the wooden ceiling, absorbing the gentle sounds of the night. A decision loomed ahead, one I would have to face soon. But for now, I chose to let them sleep peacefully, cocooned in warmth. For tonight, they were safe, and that moment paused, full of connection and hope, felt just right. The dim glow of the fire provided a reluctant warmth, its flickering embers casting lively shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the nighttime air was thick and still, holding an uneasy silence that felt almost palpable, as if it were waiting for something to unfold. This wasn't the comforting quiet of the countryside. Instead, it felt charged with an unseen tension, making every sound seem amplified. Mara, the dog, was curled protectively around her 3 puppies, her golden eyes watching the door intently. She had been still for nearly an hour, yet her body was tense and alert, reacting to every creak of the floor or gust of wind that rattled the cabin. It was clear she was drained but determined not to succumb to rest. Her instincts were finely tuned, and every few minutes she'd glance towards the window, as if anticipating a visitor. Earlier in the evening, I had a troubling encounter with some men whose intentions were now etched in my mind. Their presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that they weren't just looking for any stray dog. They had come specifically for Mara. The unspoken threat in the man's voice still haunted me, gnawing away at the edges of my thoughts. I shifted in my chair, feeling the weight of the atmosphere settle over me, a heaviness that made the chill in the room more pronounced. I reached for my mug, but found the tea inside cold and uninviting. It hardly mattered. My mind was elsewhere, actively piecing together the unsettling clues of the night. Suddenly, Mara drew my attention again as she turned her head to look at me. The protective guard she'd held for so long gave way to a relationship based on trust. Her gaze was steady and filled with an intelligence that transcended mere instinct, revealing a depth of understanding that I hadn't expected. The contours of her face were defined in the firelight, highlighting the struggles she had faced, evident in the thinness of her fur and the hunger that clung to her. In that moment, it became clear that our bond was more profound than I initially realized. As I observed her, a sense of understanding began to dawn on me. There was something in her gaze that suggested she had a story to tell, a plea that transcended words. It became clear that she was more aware of our situation than I had initially realized. With care, I approached her, extending my hand cautiously to allow her the choice to come closer. She hesitated for a moment, her ears twitching back, but finally she leaned in. Her cold nose brushed against my skin, a brief yet meaningful connection. This was a significant shift. It was the first time she moved towards me rather than retreating, signaling a flicker of openness. As she shifted, I noticed the wound along her ribs, partially concealed by her tangled fur. A slow wave of concern washed over me. The scabbed area indicated it was neither fresh nor fully healed, the ragged edges still bearing a faint trace of red. This injury suggested something more sinister than a simple accident. This was likely a deliberate act of harm. My heart sank at the thought of a sharp blade being used against her. I took a slow breath, trying to manage the rising tension within me. The pieces of this unfolding puzzle began to fit together. She hadn't just chosen to leave, she had escaped from a life that sought to control her. The realization weighed heavily in my stomach, a knot of uncertainty twisting within me. The man from the door, with his authoritative tone and unsettling expectations, suddenly made sense. He was not searching for a lost pet, he was seeking to reclaim something he believed was his. Mara inched closer to the warmth of the fire, her gaze fixed on me, seemingly assessing my response. But there was no need for her concern. I was already resolved in my decision. I wouldn't surrender her. A determined conviction settled firmly within me. While I had no knowledge of the life she had fled or the challenges she faced, one thing was increasingly clear. This was not a return to her past. She wouldn't be going back to them, not if I had any say in it. Outside the cabin, the night loomed large, silent yet foreboding. I sensed that those men were still out there, watching, waiting, and convinced that the matter was unresolved. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps this was just the beginning. The cabin felt snug, illuminated by the flickering firelight that danced across the walls, creating shadows that seemed to close in around me. A heavy realization settled in my chest. Mara had not simply been abandoned, she had escaped. The fresh wound on her ribs spoke volumes, indicating that her suffering was recent and still raw. It was clear, someone had hurt her, and that person was still searching for her. As I paused to take in the scene, my eyes fell on the puppies nestled in my sweater. They were so small, their breaths weak and uneven. It was more than just the cold that they had survived. They were living reminders of the challenges they had faced, likely due to the same individual who had caused Mara harm. The thought ignited an instinctive protectiveness within me. Mara, despite her pain and fatigue, observed me with wary eyes. I could see uncertainty etched into her features. After everything, she was waiting, perhaps expecting me to betray her trust like so many others before. It was a moment that weighed heavily on my heart. This wouldn't happen on my watch. With deliberate movements, I shifted toward the fire to grab a small pot and pour warm water into a bowl. I did my best to make noise while reaching for a clean rag, hoping to soothe her anxiety. Kneeling beside her, I spoke softly. "It's going to sting a bit, girl." I noticed her ears perk up, and she stiffened at my approach, yet she didn't shy away. As the warm cloth touched her wounded skin, she flinched and let out a low growl, but I was relieved she didn't snap at me. Instead, she released a shaky breath, allowing me to help. This was the first sign of her tentative trust. Carefully, I tended to her injury, wiping away the dirt and focusing on gentle, rhythmic motions. She winced, but she remained still, demonstrating a small break in the walls she had built around herself. I understood that I couldn't take this trust lightly. Once I finished, I reached for some leftover sausage, tearing off a piece and offering it to her. "You're tougher than you look." I tried to keep my tone light and reassuring. "I think you deserve this." She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a surprising gentleness, she took the food from my hand, swallowing it quickly and licking her lips afterward. Witnessing this small act brought a slow smile to my face. Progress was being made. Leaning back, I released a deep breath and relaxed my tense shoulders, feeling a flicker of hope in the air. The cold morning air felt heavy and unwelcome as I stepped outside, my breath escaping in a soft fog. Silence enveloped everything, a stillness that made the hair on my neck stand up. The ground crunched beneath my boots, frost hardening the earth like a silent alarm, urging me to remain alert. As I scanned the space beyond my property, unease tightened in my stomach. Then I noticed them, footprints. Fresh tracks leading from the tree line, stopping just short of the porch before retreating back into the shadows. Someone had been watching. I couldn't shake the weight of the past few hours. The memories of the night before replayed in my mind. A knock at the door, a man's slow, deliberate words that lingered like a threatening echo. "Be careful, a dog like that brings problems." It wasn't merely advice, it felt like a promise of danger. Returning to the cabin, my gaze fell on Mara, the dog I had found earlier. She lay curled around her 3 puppies, fiercely protective yet unable to find true rest. Her ears flicked at every creak, every tiny sound, betraying her anxiety. She had endured much, her instincts honed by survival. I understood her fear. The world had taught her not to trust easily. Yet something felt different now. I realized that I didn't want to part with her and her pups. It wasn't about obligation or pity. Instead, a part of me recognized that after years of solitude in this quiet countryside, I needed them as much as they needed me. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt alive, filled with potential instead of emptiness. I hesitated, my thoughts racing. The presence of that man lingered in my mind, a reminder that safety was still far from guaranteed. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going to drive Mara away. Protecting her was now a part of my purpose. A choice that felt right amid the uncertainty. The sound of the cold wind barely masked the tension that filled the air. It was clear to me now that the situation was more complicated than I had initially thought. Instead of a single set of tracks, I now found 2, perhaps even 3, pressed firmly into the dirt. This wasn't just a solitary figure searching for a lost dog. There was a larger, more organized presence that I couldn't ignore. Mara was beside me, her unease palpable. She had stepped onto the porch but stayed close to the doorway, her body low and her tail rigid. Her focus was fixed on the tree line where the tracks had emerged. In that moment, it was evident that she understood the gravity of what we were facing. This wasn't simply going to go away. With my mind racing, I contemplated my options. I could gather Mara and the puppies and leave, but doing so meant abandoning everything I had worked for. Alternatively, I could stand firm and confront whatever this group intended. The uncertainty was overwhelming. Before I could settle on a decision, a voice broke through the chilled air. "Hey there, friend." I turned sharply, instinctively tensing as 2 figures approached along the dirt road. They moved deliberately, reminiscent of a predator that knows it has already initiated the chase. The first man was familiar from the night before, while the other was broader, dressed in a heavy coat and boots caked with mud. They weren't in a rush, and that only heightened my unease. Mara let out a low growl, barely audible but filled with warning. She might not have spoken a word, but her body language screamed fear. As I stepped off the porch to meet them, I tried to maintain a relaxed demeanor despite the tension knotting my muscles. "You lost?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. The first man smiled, though the lack of genuine warmth in his expression was unsettling. "Nah, just thought I'd check in, see if you remembered anything about that dog I was asking about." His gaze drifted toward my cabin, a clear hint that he knew more than he was letting on. "Seems like you've got company." I kept my face neutral. "Found some strays last night. Poor things were half frozen." "That so?" A twitch of his lips hinted amusement, but there was something untrustworthy in his eyes. The second man, the stockier one, chuckled softly, his voice rough. "Strays, huh? That's funny, 'cause we lost one recently, and she had pups too." As the last bits of daylight faded, thick clouds rolled in, slowly enveloping the countryside in darkness. The atmosphere felt heavy, charged with tension, much like the moment I had just experienced. I stood there, mindful of the protective stance that Mara had taken. She was alert, her ears pinned back and her breathing shallow, a clear sign of unease that told me this was no ordinary encounter. The men had tested me, their deliberate movements suggesting they were not just casually interested. "Is that so?" I had replied, tilting my head slightly to match their gaze. The first man moved closer, narrowing the space between us, but he didn't come off as overtly aggressive, at least not yet. It felt like a game, one where they were probing for weakness. "Yeah, she's a special dog to us," he had said, his tone a mix of assertion and warning. "We wouldn't want her ending up in the wrong hands." His words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat that made Mara growl softly, casting her body in front of her 3 puppies. The second man shifted his attention back to me after briefly attempting to gauge Mara's response. "Mind if we take a look? We want to make sure she isn't the one we're searching for." The implied command was unmistakable. They weren't politely asking for my cooperation. I took a slow breath, firmly rooting myself. "Not going to happen. If you're looking for your dog, check the shelter in town," I said, keeping my tone steady and even. For an instant, I caught a glimpse of something calculated in the first man's eyes. Not quite rage yet, but definitely a chill that hinted at deeper thoughts. "Shame," he chuckled lightly, his voice dripping with insincerity. With that, he stepped back, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I guess we'll see you around." They turned and retraced their steps, their boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. I remained still, watching until they vanished behind the trees, letting out a controlled breath once the air was clear again. Mara still stood rigid beside me, her body tense with fear. It was clear now, she was not afraid of just anyone. The presence of those men had unsettled her deeply, and instinctively, I understood that they were far from finished with us. The darkness outside the cabin was complete, interrupted only by the faint glow of a distant village nestled beyond the hills. I recalled the tension of earlier that evening, when I had encountered those men. Their glares were pointed, and their choice of words felt deliberate, suggesting they had no intention of simply walking away. In the corner, Mara stayed close to the fire, her body curled protectively around her 3 puppies. Though she remained still, tension radiated from her. I could see her ears twitch at every sound, her golden brown eyes shifting toward the door whenever the wind howled outside. She had been through this kind of fear before, far longer than I had. She understood when danger lurked nearby. Rising from my chair, I approached the small window next to the door. As I peered into the blackness beyond the trees, an unsettling feeling twisted in my stomach. This land felt isolating, too far away for anyone to hear our cries for help, too open to hide us from those who might wish us harm. Then I noticed it, a flicker of movement. At first it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the night, but then I realized it was no animal or gust of wind. A shape moved, followed by another. They had returned. Reacting quickly, I grabbed the lantern from the windowsill and extinguished its light in one swift motion. The fire behind me still glowed softly, but the cabin was no longer a beacon in the night. Mara sensed the shift in tension, her head lifting as alertness replaced her earlier calmness. "Stay here," I whispered, knowing she wouldn't understand my words, but she could feel the change in my demeanor. She readied herself for what was to come as I made my way toward the door, my footsteps deliberate and controlled. Outside, the wind picked up, its whistling through the trees barely masking the sound of approaching footsteps. They were close enough to hear now, deliberately audible, as if they wanted to remind me of their presence. With a steadying breath, I reached for the fire poker resting beside the hearth, feeling its cold iron handle in my grip. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something, more reassuring than the relentless pounding of my heart. And then I heard it, a hand brushing against the doorknob. The metallic sound grinding against the wood sent a jolt through me as I braced myself. The handle twisted slowly, and I felt every muscle lock in anticipation. It didn't open. The pounding on the door grew louder, each thud reverberating through the house like a drumbeat, signaling that the situation had escalated. Awash with tension, I stood ready, knowing I had to act decisively. The growl from Mara, deep and primal, vibrated through the wooden floor, causing the tiny puppies beneath her to stir but not wake. They were a picture of innocence, and I wouldn't let them come to harm. Suddenly, a voice sliced through the silence, a casual murmur from the man outside, as if he was engaging in small talk rather than intimidation. "Come on now," he said, light and teasing. "No need to make this difficult." I remained silent, unwilling to respond. The air thickened with unspoken tension, and then came another knock. This one more aggressive, a demand, not a test. "You've got something that don't belong to you," he continued, amusement creeping into his words. "I figured I'd come by and give you a chance to make things right. No harm done." His words wrapped around me like a vine, constricting but familiar. This was not about resolution. It was raw power play, an attempt to pull me into his twisted game. Most would capitulate when faced with such intimidation, but I refused to be one of them. Each moment stretched, heavy with pressure. Finally, the door shuddered under a hard kick. A warning, not yet violence, but a clear sign that he meant business. Mara rose instinctively, fur bristling, protective of her pups. I tightened my grip on a fire poker, heart racing with the knowledge that I had to defend my ground. Another kick followed, even more forceful, the old wood groaning under the pressure. "Open the door, boy. Don't make us do this the hard way," he warned, his tone chilling and commanding. With measured breathing, I felt the weight of my decision press upon me. They wanted a fight, a reason to remind me of my position. This was all a game to them, but I wouldn't let them win. Mara's snarls rose to a fierce crescendo, her warning echoing in the space around us. But she was hurt. Her strength wouldn't hold against them if they broke through. That realization solidified my resolve. I could not let them enter. In a swift motion, I grabbed the shotgun from the wall, though it wasn't loaded or even cleaned in months. They wouldn't know that. The sound of the bolt echoed in the silence, and a hush fell outside. Stepping closer to the door, I let my voice reach beyond, steady and cold. "You take one more step toward this door, and I swear to God, I'll put you in the ground." The cabin was filled with a tense silence, the fire flickering quietly as it consumed the last of its wood. The air hung heavy with the smell of charred timber and an unsettling mix of fear. My hands still felt the strain from clutching the shotgun earlier, and the gun now lay nearby, replaced by a different kind of weight, an awareness that danger lingered just outside. Mara, tense and alert, remained by the puppies, her body coiled tight as she listened intently to the sounds beyond the door. It was clear to both of us that we hadn't escaped yet. The men who had approached us earlier were not finished. They would be back, and next time, they would likely come prepared, more aggressive. It put me on edge, and I knew I had to consider my next steps carefully. I rose cautiously and approached the window, mindful of every movement. Outside, a thick blanket of darkness loomed, as if the night itself were waiting to engulf us. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of life, any hint of movement that might foreshadow their return. Even though the men had retreated, I could sense their presence still hovering nearby, an oppressive weight that made me feel like we were being watched. Turning away from the window, I raked my fingers through my hair and let out a slow breath. I needed to think of a plan. Staying here would only give them the upper hand. They had numbers and weapons, while I was left with little more than a fire poker, an old shotgun, and a frightened dog with her 3 hungry pups. What was I going to do? The reality pressed in, demanding an answer before it was too late. Just then, a rustle from outside caught Mara's attention. I froze, waiting to see if the threat was real or simply my racing thoughts playing tricks on me. Better to be prepared for anything, I told myself. My heart pounded, echoing the uncertainty of our situation. The cold night air pressed against me as I pushed open the back door, a gust of wind hitting me like an icy wall. I could feel the urgency in the moment. There was no time to waste. I had to keep moving. "Come on, girl," I urged, glancing back at Mara, who hesitated, torn between staying with her pups and the uncertainty that lay ahead. A muffled sound echoed through the stillness, engines approaching. The noise grew louder, and an unsettling realization settled in. They were coming back, and this time, it felt different. I could sense it in the air, a looming confrontation rather than a mere search. As I crouched beside Mara, I rubbed her thin neck, seeking to comfort both her and myself. "I won't let them take you," I whispered, meeting her worn gaze, which sparkled with a flicker of trust, a small but vital flame amid despair. Torn with frustration and guilt, I felt a sharp sting in my throat, knowing I should have acted sooner to protect her. Mara shifted, letting out a soft whine as she pressed closer to her pups, instinctively shielding them with her frail body. The puppies huddled together, their tiny forms seeking solace in one another. I couldn't imagine dragging Mara and her newborns through the bitter night. The village was too far, and the cold would be unforgiving. I could sense the tension mounting in Mara as her body tensed under my hand, her growl rumbling like thunder through the cabin. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to stand her ground. But I feared that if they breached this refuge, there wouldn't be a fight, only an ending. Footsteps broke the silence, steady and purposeful this time. I moved quickly, gathering the bundle of pups with delicate care, wrapping them in my sweater to shield them from the elements. My heart raced, but I remained focused. I grabbed the shotgun again, the weight of it providing a modest sense of security. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I glanced toward the back door again, contemplating our escape. Mara finally seemed to understand. The instinct to protect her pups surged through her, but I needed to make a choice. We had no other option. The harsh whistle of the wind urged me onward, and I stepped into the dark night, knowing it was now or never. I made a quick decision and veered hard to the right, spotting an old hunting shack in the distance. It was barely standing, its wooden beams weathered and crooked, but it offered some shelter. I gritted my teeth, staring at the shack, and encouraged Mara softly, "This way." Mara didn't hesitate. Despite her weakened state, she followed me without question. Together, we navigated through the shadows of the forest, where the wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak like old bones. The cold air was sharp against my skin, and the bundled pups pressed closely against me, their tiny bodies offering a shred of warmth. Behind us, the cabin door burst open, and I caught a distant shout. A voice, furious and commanding, echoed through the night. "Find them!" The sound sent adrenaline coursing through me, an electric surge that pushed me to run even faster. I could hear the footsteps behind us grow louder, crunching through the frost-covered leaves as the pursuers fanned out in the darkness. Mara was close, her golden eyes shining, but even she was struggling. I could see her steps falter a bit, uneven as she pressed on. She was a fighter, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she was absolutely forced to. But with everything she had already endured, I worried she might not have the strength to keep going. Our situation was critical. The woods were thick, but I also remembered the open fields near my cabin. We wouldn't have dense cover for too long. If they had flashlights, they could easily track our movements. If they were armed, we stood little chance. As I pushed ahead, my mind raced ahead of my feet, scanning the terrain for options. I could feel my heart pounding in my skull, almost drowning out all other sounds. The wind was fierce, but all I focused on was the urgent need to stay ahead and remain unseen. "Fan out!" I heard another voice command sharply, growing more frustrated. She couldn't have gotten far. They were getting closer, and I knew we had to find safety quickly. I sprinted toward the shack, urging Mara to keep up. In that moment, it felt like our survival depended on every ounce of strength and trust we had left. The sound of footsteps faded into the distance, and at last, silence enveloped the air. I took a moment to process the stillness, my heart still racing as I leaned against the damp wall of the shack. With careful movements, I relaxed my grip on the fire poker, feeling the tension in my fingers ease. Mara, ever vigilant, remained beside me. Her breathing was slow but steady, each inhale revealing how exhausted she was, yet still alert to any threat. The pups curled against me, their soft whimpers a reminder of our precarious situation. In this cramped space, the smell of dust and rotting wood surrounded us, closing in like a shroud. Before we sought shelter here, I had glimpsed the men outside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and their shadows casting long shapes against the trees. They were searching, drawing closer with every second. "You see anything?" one of them had asked, To which another had replied, deeper and more menacing, "No, but she's near, I can feel it." The tension had surged then. Mara had been tense, ready to protect us with her low, almost imperceptible growl, a true guardian in a moment of crisis. I couldn't help but be reminded of how instinct often drives both animals and humans in times of fear. Just as I braced myself for the worst, a sharp whistle pierced the night, calling the men back. "Forget it. We'll wait till morning. She can't run forever." They chose caution over confrontation, and as their footsteps retreated, I held my breath, waiting until I was sure they had really gone. Time stretched, and each second felt like a small eternity. Finally, I dared to exhale softly. Mara took a small breath, her body relaxing slightly but remaining alert. I knew her strength came not just from her physical prowess, but also from the bond we shared, a connection that drove her to keep watch, even in her fatigue. With the pups nestled against me, I felt my body thrum with the aftermath of adrenaline. Though we were safe for the moment, the night was still long, and I was aware that we had to stay vigilant as I clung to the hope that dawn would bring the light of safety. The silence around us was thick, enveloping the night as we processed the events that had just unfolded. I leaned against the wooden wall of the shack, allowing the weight of the moment to settle in. Mara lay curled beside me, her golden eyes half closed, yet they sparkled with a deeper understanding. It was more than just trust or fear. She recognized the urgency of our situation. We couldn't linger here. "You feel it too, don't you?" I whispered, barely breaking the hush. This was not the end. The men might be gone for now, but it wouldn't be long before they returned. The forest was still, but it felt like an impending storm, a reminder that we were being hunted. Mara's body rose and fell rhythmically, her exhaustion evident, but she was still alert, every muscle tuned to the slightest sound. I couldn't help but admire her resilience. It struck me how she had been fighting long before I became part of her journey, carrying the weight of this struggle with her. I had made my choice the moment I opened my door to her, and there was no turning back now. As I carefully adjusted the puppies nestled against her, I felt the sting of the cold air against my skin. "We can't keep running forever," I murmured, grappling with our reality. Staying hidden forever would only lead to more suffering, be it from the relentless cold, hunger, or the men pursuing us. Going back to my cabin would only guide them straight to safety, leaving us cornered. I reached for my coat, taking a deep breath to steel myself. "We have to end this," I said softly, knowing we needed to confront our fears instead of fleeing from them. Mara lifted her head, meeting my gaze with the kind of solidarity that made my heart pound. She was ready, and so was I. "Let's finish what we started," I urged, stepping toward the door and peering into the darkness of the woods. The air was brisk, but there was a determination in my heart that kept me warm. As I turned back to Mara, she pushed herself up, shaking off the weariness in her limbs. Together, we stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next, refusing to be the prey any longer. Mara wasn't just any stray. She was a fighter, a survivor in every sense of the word. While some may think of rescue as a straightforward act of taking in an animal and providing a home, the reality is much more complex. It involves a battle, the struggle for survival, the building of trust, and sometimes confronting the past traumas that haunt them long before they cross paths with you. For the men who thought they were in control, the tables had turned. They had underestimated Mara's strength, and now they found themselves in the position of being hunted. This situation raises an important question. What does it truly mean to ensure a second chance for those in need? If this story resonates with you, perhaps it's time to take action. Local shelters constantly seek support, whether through volunteering time or spreading the word about animals that need help. As we reflect on Mara's journey, it becomes clear that this is just the beginning. The challenges she faces may be daunting, but with each step there is hope and possibility. So if you are curious about what unfolds next, stick around. There's more to come, and every moment counts for Mara and her puppies.